Story 1. The Silent Passenger. My name's Drew Mathis. I live in Butler, Pennsylvania. I'm a mechanic by trade, always have been. But for a while, I was also driving part-time for a rideshare app called Rider. Nothing major, just some extra cash to pay off bills. My hours were mostly night shifts, and that was never a problem until October of last year. That month messed me up in ways I still can't explain. And yeah, I'm telling this because I need to, not because anyone will believe me. It was the second week of October. The trees had that burnt orange color. The air had that late fall bite. The kind of cold that seeps into your bones, even if the heater's running. I had just finished dropping off some drunk kids near Moraine State Park and was thinking about calling it a night when I got a ping, a new ride request, from a place called Hollow Creek Lane. Now let me tell you, Hollow Creek ain't even on most modern maps. Locals here know it more as a legend than a real road. People say it used to be part of some settlement that burned down in the 1930s. No one goes out there now. The land's unmarked. No streetlights. Trees so thick they blot out the moon. It's the kind of road people intentionally forget. But I figured, hell, a ride's a ride. The GPS routed me onto this dirt path that looked barely wide enough for my car. Trees clawed at the sides of my windshield. There was this constant tapping, not like branches, but faster, almost like fingers. And then I saw her. She was standing about 50 feet away under a dead maple tree. No phone, no bag, just staring into the woods like she'd been waiting for hours. She looked dry, like she hadn't had water in days. Clothes loose like they didn't fit her anymore. She wasn't shivering, though the temperature was dropping fast. I called out, "Rider for Katie." She turned. Her eyes, those eyes, I'll never forget them. Dull, colorless, like someone had drained the life out of them drop by drop. She didn't blink, didn't smile, just walked to the car like she'd done it 1,000 times. She slid into the back seat without a word. No destination popped up on the app. I looked back at her. "You all right? You want me to take you somewhere?" She stared at me through the rearview mirror. Not at me, through me, like I was a dirty window. Then she said in a voice so dry it sounded like gravel scraping against metal, "Take me home." I said, "Okay, where's home?" She looked out the window and said nothing. A minute later, she whispered, "Keep going." So I did. And from there, it got worse. The heater in my car stopped working. My phone shut off, even though it was at 80%. My dash lights flickered like there was an electrical fault. The forest around us seemed to press in tighter and tighter. Then the smell hit. Moldy earth, rot, and something sweet, sickly sweet, like old meat. I checked the back seat through the mirror. She was sitting perfectly still, except now her head was turned just a bit more toward me. Not enough to be natural, just off. She started humming, a tune I'd never heard before. It wasn't pretty. It sounded broken, like a lullaby played backward. I tried to shake it off. Just a weird girl. Maybe mentally unwell. Maybe I was overthinking. But then she said it again. "Turn here." There was no road, just a break in the trees. But I turned anyway. It led us to an open field, and in that field sat a farmhouse, weathered, blackened by fire, with every window covered in old newspapers, their ink bled away by decades of rain. The roof sagged like it was breathing. There were handprints on the porch rails, small ones, too small. She said, "We're here," and got out. I sat there, frozen. My gut told me to leave, but I got out anyway, drawn by something I can't explain. I followed her up the porch. She walked straight through the front door, only it wasn't open. It was sealed shut, nailed with iron crosses, char marks above the frame. But she passed through like a shadow, like smoke curling under a door. And then I heard it. Laughter. Dozens of voices. Children, adults, all mixed together. Crying, laughing, whispering, coming from inside that dead house. I backed away, got in my car, tore out of there so fast I almost slammed into a tree. When I got home, the app had no record of the trip. My mileage tracker showed I'd only driven 2.3 miles that entire hour. My phone had factory reset itself. My dashboard clock was blinking 2:17 a.m. over and over. 3 days later, 2 detectives came to my door, said I'd been flagged in a cold case, showed me a missing persons photo. Her name was Caitlin Gorman, vanished 1 year ago that exact week. Same area. Last seen wearing the same hoodie, same jeans. She had been declared legally dead 6 months earlier. I told them everything. They didn't laugh. They didn't even blink. One of them, an older guy named Detective Looks, just said, "She's still wandering." You're not the first to see her. Then he showed me a folder full of driver complaints from 2019, 2020, 2021, all reporting a silent girl matching Caitlin's description. Same destination, same farmhouse. Some drivers said she spoke in dreams after they dropped her off. One guy claimed he saw her face in the trees days later. You know what they all had in common? Every one of those drivers, within 6 months, either went missing, quit society, or ended up in psychiatric holds. One guy burned his car and moved to Alaska. I tried to forget, deleted my accounts, changed phones, moved apartments. But it didn't help. Every year on the anniversary of the ride, at exactly 2:17 a.m., my phone turns on, even if it's off, and I get a notification. Rider alert, Katie is waiting for pickup. Sometimes I hear footsteps on the gravel outside my window. Sometimes I find muddy handprints on my car door, even if it hasn't rained. And sometimes, when I look in the rearview mirror, I see her, not sitting, just smiling, waiting. Story 2. The Body in the Wall. I've worked construction most of my life. I've seen some messed up things on job sites. Dead raccoons stuffed in attics, black mold crawling up walls like cancer. But what we uncovered at the Hale place, that still claws at my dreams, night after night. It was the summer of 2022, and Charleston was a furnace. The humidity wasn't just suffocating. It felt deliberate, like something alive was pressing its weight onto you. I was hired by Brian and Kelly Monroe, a couple from Atlanta who'd just bought the Hale place on Pine Hollow Road at a foreclosure auction. Dirt cheap. Too cheap. That should have been the first warning. The house sat quiet, cloaked in ivy like it was trying to hide its own shame. Locals had stories, whispers of strange lights, vanished tenants, and screams swallowed by the night. The Monroes thought it was superstition. They wanted a charming fixer-upper. But that house wasn't broken. It was waiting. From day one, things were off. Not dramatic, just wrong. The air was heavy, stale, thick with silence. It didn't creak or moan. It listened, like it was drawing in every sound, every breath, into its rotting bones. We laughed it off. Guys on the crew joked about ghosts and cursed basements. But when the tools stopped, when the drills fell silent and the hammering paused, the quiet that followed was too deep. You could hear your own heartbeat, and something beneath it, a sound like breathing behind the walls. Then came the smell, not constant. It drifted, metallic, sweet, putrid, like rusting meat and something older. It moved through the house like it had legs. We blamed dead rats, maybe mold, but it was always strongest in the south bedroom, the one with the warped floorboards, the windows sealed shut with yellowed newspapers from the 1970s. That room was colder than the rest, even in the dead heat of summer. The day we found the first body, I remember waking up with a headache so sharp it made my eyes water. Ra was already there, busting through plaster when his crowbar hit something solid, but not wood. A dull, wet thump. We froze, then the wall shifted, just slightly, like it exhaled. Ray backed up. I peeled away the crumbling drywall, exposing a hidden compartment, a hollow behind the studs, about 4 feet tall. Inside, something wrapped in plastic and burlap. It twitched when I touched it. The top disintegrated under my fingers, and a hand fell out, dried, blackened, twisted. The fingernails were still there, long, yellow, curled inward. The skin had pulled so tight it looked like dried leather stretched over broken sticks. Ray screamed. I didn't. I couldn't. I just stared. The body had been bent, knees to chest, arms curled around itself, like it had curled in pain or fear, before being stuffed inside the wall. Police cordoned the house. Within 2 weeks, they found 4 more. One behind the bathtub, entombed in mildew and mildew-slick tiles. One under the staircase, teeth scattered like dropped dice. 2 beneath the crawl space, hidden under layers of brick dust and time. Every one of them mummified, preserved unnaturally, as if the house had kept them that way, stored them, loved them. Then came the journals. We found them in a rusted ammunition box beneath a loose floorboard in the upstairs hallway. 17 notebooks, each one more meticulous than the last. The handwriting was elegant, clean, not the scrawl of a madman. Each entry catalogued a life, not a diary, a ledger. He called himself Father. Never a real name, never a location. The house was the mouth. Victims were offerings. One entry, the mouth must eat. To feed it is to become eternal. The walls are its veins. They hunger, always. The gifts squirm, but the silence devours their cries. That is sacred. Another, boy with freckled hands, screamed when I brought him in. The mouth pulsed. It likes the small ones. They last longer. Some entries were just numbers, dates. We realized they matched the disappearances of local children, travelers, runaways. Over 30 years, dozens. The last entry was dated August 17th, 1981. They are all here now. 31. I hear them in the walls. They don't sleep. They gnaw. I cannot sleep either. The mouth demands me now. I will give myself fully. I will become its tongue. That was the end. Police tried to track the writer. Locals remembered Ezra Hale, preacher, recluse, paranoid zealot. Said he ran sermons from the basement, claimed the house stood on a holy seam. His sons vanished in the late 70s. Ezra disappeared in 81. No death certificate. Just gone. Then they found the real basement. Behind a false wall, down a staircase of crumbling brick, was a space like a chapel. Stone altar, wax puddles, symbols carved deep into the walls, too deep for any blade I've known. Circles filled with jagged mouths, hands with too many fingers, bones hanging from the ceiling like chimes, and in the center, an eye, a massive mosaic on the floor, broken tile and stained bone forming a lidless eye. staring up, eternally open, and when I stood over it, I swear to God, I felt something blink. The crawlspace was worse. They found hundreds of bones, shattered, gnawed, filed. Some had holes drilled through them like jewelry. Others were child-sized. Finger bones no bigger than matchsticks. Jawbones with missing teeth. Sheriff Danner, a man who'd seen 2 decades of violent crime, puked twice during recovery. Said the tooth marks were human, some fresh. That was it for me. I walked off the job, left my gear, never went back, burned my clothes. I started drinking again just to sleep. But the dreams, they don't stop. I see the walls flex like lungs, hear scratching beneath the paint. I wake up to whispers in my ear. Always the same phrase, feed the mouth. They said the house was condemned, but I drove by 3 months ago. Couldn't help myself. The boards were gone, windows clear, door wide open, light flickered inside, and through the upstairs window, a silhouette. It didn't move like a person. There's no power, and still, it waits. They say a house is just wood and nails, but some houses, some are built around something much older, something hungry, and some doors, once opened, never truly close. Story 3, 911, from the basement. My name's Peter Whitmore. I'm a mechanical engineer by trade, nothing fancy. Just your average guy who wanted a quieter life after years in Boston. In 2021, my wife Heather and I had decided to leave the city behind and settle somewhere peaceful, somewhere we could breathe, and maybe raise a family. That somewhere turned out to be a sleepy little town in western Massachusetts called Ashfield. Population just under 2,000. It was all winding roads, towering pine trees, and neighbors who waved but kept to themselves. Exactly what we wanted. The house we bought was an old colonial from the 1920s, white, with forest green shutters and an overgrown garden that gave it charm. It sat on the edge of a hill, surrounded by thick woods, and had one of those old New England-style stone basements. Cold, musty, with pipes that moaned when the furnace kicked on. We moved in during late October, right as the last of the leaves turned. It was beautiful, but even then I remember thinking the place felt heavy, like the walls held in more than just heat. Heather was the first to mention the noises. I brushed them off at first. Old houses creak, especially when they settle or when the temperature drops. But it wasn't just creaking. It was a dragging sound, like something being pulled across the basement floor. Sometimes it sounded like tapping, almost rhythmic. She'd hear it when she was alone, usually in the evenings. I was usually too tired from work to care, or to believe. That changed 2 weeks in. It was a Saturday night. We were watching TV in the living room, popcorn between us, a fire crackling in the hearth. Then we heard it, loud, a distinct bang from below. Not subtle, not something you could mistake for the furnace. It sounded like someone had dropped a heavy object in the basement. Heather froze, eyes wide. I paused the movie and listened. A moment passed, then another bang. I grabbed a flashlight and headed for the basement door, trying to look calm. Heather trailed behind me. Barefoot on the wood floor, the door creaked open, and a wave of cold air hit me, colder than it should have been. The basement light flickered once and died. Old wiring, I muttered, mostly to convince myself. I crept down the stairs, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The basement was exactly as we left it. Paint cans, old moving boxes, the washer and dryer. Nothing was out of place. No sign of anything fallen. No intruders. I even checked the windows, all locked, no signs of forced entry. But that air, it was bitter cold, like winter in a cellar. I swear I could see my breath. We tried to ignore it. We had to. Moving again wasn't an option, but the sounds got worse. Almost every night, always from the basement. Sometimes scratching, sometimes a low, groaning creak like wood straining under pressure. A few times we thought we heard whispering. Faint, muffled, like someone was talking just below the floorboards. We stopped going down there unless we had to. Then came the phone call. It was around 2:30 in the morning. Heather and I were asleep when the house phone rang. An old landline that came with the house. We hadn't used it once. I picked it up groggily, still half asleep. "Mr. Whitmore?" A woman said. "This is Dispatch Officer Reynolds with Ashfield Emergency Services. We received a 911 call traced to your address. Is everything all right?" That woke me up instantly. I sat up, heart pounding. "I didn't call 911, I said. "Sir, the call came from your secondary landline, the one registered to your basement line." My blood ran cold. "We don't have a phone in the basement," I replied. "At least, not one we use. There's an old jack down there, but it's not connected." She paused. The call lasted 11 seconds. No voice on the line, just background noise, like movement, breathing. Heather was awake now, watching me with alarm. I told the dispatcher we'd check the house and she offered to send a cruiser. I declined. More out of pride than anything. I wish I hadn't. I grabbed the flashlight again, this time with a baseball bat. We went down together. Every step creaked underfoot. The air felt like ice. When we reached the bottom, the silence was crushing. But then Heather pointed toward the far wall, behind the shelves. Something was different. We moved the shelving unit, and behind it, partially hidden by crumbling drywall, was a phone. An old rotary phone, the kind from the 70s, mounted on the wall, connected to the line. We never noticed it before. It looked as though it had been sealed behind the drywall and recently uncovered. I didn't want to touch it, but I picked up the receiver. It was warm. There was no dial tone. We called the police the next morning. They searched the basement, found nothing unusual besides the phone. One officer mentioned the house had a history. A man named Lionel Crenshaw had owned it in the 70s. School teacher, lived alone, went missing in 1981. Never found. Heather started waking up with bruises, always on her arms and legs, deep purple, like handprints. She said she felt pressure in her sleep, like something was pressing down on her. We brought in a priest, not a paranormal investigator, just a local Episcopal father. He walked the house, said a blessing, even sprinkled holy water in the basement. For a few days, it was quiet. Then things escalated. The 911 calls started coming more frequently, sometimes in the middle of the day. Each time, the dispatcher said they heard faint voices, crying, screaming. The most chilling call came 2 weeks later. Officer Reynolds called again, her voice shaking. "Peter, this time." We heard a woman. She said, "Help me. He's here. He won't let me go." Then the line went dead. We asked for the recording. They couldn't release it. Ongoing investigation, they said. Heather broke down that night. She begged me to sell the house. I agreed. But the market was slow, and no one wanted to buy a 100-year-old fixer-upper on the edge of the woods. Then, the basement door began opening on its own. We'd wake up, and it'd be open. We tried locking it. Deadbolt, even tied it shut with rope once. Still found it open. Sometimes the light would be on, even though we never used the switch anymore. One night I came downstairs and found muddy footprints on the hardwood floor, leading from the basement door all the way to our bedroom. The final straw came when I installed a motion camera in the basement. It was one of those infrared trail cams. I checked the footage the next morning. Most of it was empty, just dust floating. Then, at 3:12 a.m., the motion sensor triggered. A figure appeared in the frame. A tall man, balding, wearing what looked like a 1970s-style jacket. His face was blurry, like static, like the camera couldn't focus. He stood in the far corner, then slowly walked toward the camera. The video ended with the image cutting out. Just black. We left that same night. Packed what we could, booked a hotel. 2 days later, the house caught fire. Faulty wiring, the report said. But the fire started in the basement. The rotary phone melted, fused to the wall. Firemen said it looked like it had sparked. But it hadn't even been plugged into power. We never went back. We live in Maine now. Quiet cabin, newer construction, no basement. But sometimes, when it's real quiet, I swear I hear the phone ringing. And sometimes, I still dream of that voice on the line. Faint and desperate. Help me. He's here. Story 4. The Ventriloquist's House. I never really knew my Uncle Edgar. My mother used to say he was not right in the head, and my father once told me that if Edgar ever invited me over, I was to make up an excuse and stay far away. As a kid, I just assumed he was some weird recluse, the kind of person you whisper about at family dinners but never actually visit. He was my mom's older brother, about 20 years older, in fact, and while I never met him in person, I remember seeing him once at my grandmother's funeral. He was standing alone, away from everyone, in a long black coat, with a face that looked like it had been carved out of candle wax. He never smiled. He never cried. Just watched the casket like it held something he had been waiting for. So when a lawyer called me one Monday morning last fall and told me I'd inherited Uncle Edgar's house, I honestly thought it was a scam. "Mr. Dawson," the voice had said, "my name is Richard Bloom. I'm the executor of Edgar Mullen's estate. I believe you're his closest living relative. We'd like to transfer ownership of the property to you as per the will." I was about to hang up when he added, "There's no money, I'm afraid. Just the house. It's unusual." He specified that you alone were to have it. I almost said no, but curiosity has always been my weakness. The house was located in upstate New York, in a little town called Renfield, the kind of place that doesn't show up on most maps and barely has cell service. It took me nearly 7 hours to drive up there from Brooklyn. The sun was already setting when I pulled into the gravel driveway. The house was enormous, a 3-story Victorian with a sagging porch and boarded-up windows on the 3rd floor. It looked abandoned, but oddly well-maintained. The lawn was cut. The shutters were freshly painted. But there was no car, no mailbox, no sign of life. I remember pausing before unlocking the door with the antique key the lawyer had mailed me. Something about the air felt still, not quiet. Still, like the wind had decided not to blow here. The door opened with a groan that felt rehearsed, like the house had been waiting. Inside was a time capsule. The wallpaper was a faded floral pattern, yellowed with age. The furniture was heavy, old-fashioned, draped in sheets like the house was mourning itself. But what struck me immediately, what made my skin crawl, was the room full of dolls. It was off the main hallway. Double doors opened to reveal a parlor with red velvet wallpaper and gas lamps that had long since been converted to electric. Along the walls were glass cases, and in them sat dozens of ventriloquist dummies. Not toys, dummies, human-sized ones, male, female, childlike, elderly, all with porcelain faces and painted smiles. Their eyes followed you. I swear, they followed you. I was about to back out of the room when I noticed something odd. Each dummy had a nameplate. Margaret, Clive, Betsy, James. There were at least 40 of them, all labeled, all posed like they were waiting for a show. I told myself it was just a collection. Creepy, sure, but harmless. People collect weirder things. That night I chose to sleep in the upstairs guest room. I wasn't planning to stay long. Maybe a day or two to check the place out, contact a realtor and list it. But I should have left the moment I stepped in. At around 2:17 a.m., I was woken by the sound of whispering. I sat up, heart thudding. At first I thought it was the wind outside, but the windows were shut. The sound was coming from inside the house, and it was soft, like dozens of tiny voices murmuring at once, barely audible. It stopped the moment I moved. I grabbed the flashlight from my backpack and checked the hallway. Nothing. Silence. I crept down to the main floor, the wood creaking beneath my socks, and peeked into the doll room. One of the glass cases was open. The dummy inside, labeled Dale, was missing. I found him in the dining room, sitting at the head of the table, arms posed over silverware like he was about to eat. His expression seemed different. The painted smile stretched a little wider, the eyes a little darker. I locked the room and went back upstairs, chalking it up to sleepwalking, or maybe a prank played by some local kids who knew about the house. Still, I barely slept. The next morning, Dale was back in his case. The door was shut and locked. That was the beginning. Each night, I heard the whispering. Each morning, a different doll would be gone, found somewhere new, on the staircase, in the kitchen, once even sitting on the edge of my bed. But what scared me most wasn't that they moved. It was that they were getting closer. On the fourth night, I finally snapped. I decided to pack my bags and leave. Forget the house. Let someone else deal with it. But as I was gathering my things, I stepped on a loose floorboard beneath the bed. It popped up, revealing a small hidden compartment. Inside were journals, handwritten in Uncle Edgar's spidery scrawl. Dozens of them, each bound in leather. The earliest was dated 1973. The latest was just a few months ago. I opened one at random. Margaret wouldn't stop screaming. Had to silence her permanently. The saw was too messy. Switched to the wire. Cleaner. Quieter. She listens now. I felt bile rise in my throat. I read another entry. James tried to escape last night. Clever boy, but not clever enough. Took me all night to repaint his face. They always scream when I carve out the eyes. They weren't just dolls. They were people. People he had murdered, turned into dummies, preserved, painted, displayed. I stumbled back, my vision swimming. My hand brushed against something cold. I turned and saw Clive, one of the dolls, standing in the hallway, though I knew for certain he hadn't been there a moment before. His painted eyes stared straight into mine. I ran. I didn't stop to grab my things. I didn't care. I drove all night, straight to the sheriff's station in Renfield. But when the officers came back with me the next day, the house was empty. The dolls were gone, every single one. So were the journals. The sheriff gave me a long, tired look. "You sure you didn't imagine it?" he asked. "This place has been abandoned for over a year." I told him about the lawyer, the inheritance. He checked. There was no record of an Edgar Mullen in Renfield, no property deeds, no will, nothing. It was like the house, and Edgar had never existed. But I know what I saw, and sometimes, late at night, when I close my eyes, I still hear them. The whispering. Sometimes I wake up and find a small figure standing in the hallway, just watching, waiting. And when I check, the door to my closet is just slightly open, and one of my shirts has been carefully folded, like it was borrowed. And